How's it going, guys? Jay Nickel here, aka The Mindful Hunter, and we are going to do a breakdown of my 2020 arrow build. So, for starters, let's just jump into the details of what we've got. We're using a Black Eagle Rampage 250 spine. We're using AAE Max Stealth vanes, boning carbon wraps, and we have an Iron Will S125 up front. And we're also using the 100 grain focus components from Black Eagle as well. So let's take a moment, now that you know what this arrow is, let's take a moment and talk about some more details about the components and why I decided to build this arrow the way I did. So a little bit of context, I've been shooting for 4 years. This is the 4th arrow that I've built, and I feel like every time I build an arrow, I get a little bit closer to exactly what I'm looking for out of an arrow. The primary reason for that is that as I become a better archer and as I encounter more situations as a hunter, I learn more about what I need out of my arrow, and therefore I'm able to construct an arrow that fits better with my style. The first arrow I ever shot was like gold tip, straight out of the package, pre-fletched. It was like 85 or 100 grains up front. It was like 435, 450 grains all up. It was a 300 spine. I was shooting a 65 pound Hoyt Defiant at the time. Okay arrow, never killed anything with it. Then I moved into the Valkyrie system, which was totally pre-built for me by Brent over at Valkyrie Archery. He's awesome. That particular setup is amazing. Those broadheads are some of the best broadheads on the market. When I had a 65 pound bow, it actually shot pretty decent, and I liked that setup. And I took that black bear right there with that system. Loved it. However, when I moved up to an 80 pound draw, so that's the other thing. Right now I shoot a Hoyt Pro Defiant 80 pound draw at 30-inch draw length. So got a fair amount of horsepower there. Now, when I started shooting 80 pounds, even though those particular arrows, they're a super skinny arrow that he builds, they're actually the Black Eagle X Impacts. They're a super skinny arrow, and they say they're 250 spine. I believe they're 250 spine, but I think there's something weird that goes on with super skinnies when you start getting into really heavy draw weight. Because I would watch the arrow, and you could watch the paradox as it came out of my bow in slow-mo, and I had a bitch of a time. To field points I could get to fly pretty well, but I just had a bitch of a time tuning fixed blade broadheads on those super skinnies. So after that, I moved over to the Day 6 system, which was kind of like, now the Valkyrie system is not a particularly heavy setup, but it's an extreme FOC, front of center setup, north of 18%. So when I made the next transition, I wanted to try a heavy arrow with like reasonable front of center. So I went to the Day 6 arrow system, which is like 12 grains per inch on a 250 spine arrow. So I was shooting like a 600 grain setup, 100 grains up front, same fletchings I'm running now. And it was decent, but I'll be honest with you. I was in Maui last December and I shot a goat, and I was shooting down on the goat 50 yards, and I killed the goat with the first shot, but it hit him in the spine, and the arrow snapped off right in the middle of the component system. So after that arrow snapped off in the middle of the component system, it really kind of robbed me of my faith in that particular system. And I wanted to try and increase my front of center slightly while maintaining the same overall arrow weight. So that meant I had to move to a slightly lighter arrow so I could put more up front. This is where shit starts to get a little bit complicated. With the Day 6 system, it was a 12 point something grain per inch arrow with a 50 grain component and 125 grain head up front. So it's 175 grains total up front. When I moved to the Black Eagle system, it is, I want to say 10.1 grains per inch. So on a 30-inch arrow at 2 grains, I lose 60 grains total arrow weight, which allows me to use 100 grain components up front instead of 50 grain components up front. thus taking 50 grains distributed weight from my entire arrow and moving that 50 grains up here, so I increased my overall front of center. So this particular arrow weighs 600 grains total and is 13% FOC. There's some real simple calculations online if you want to measure your front of center. Basically, the front of center is how much additional weight of your arrow is in front of the center of the arrow. So a 0% FOC arrow, the balance point would be directly in the middle. But you'll notice with this arrow, the balance point technically is 13% to this side of center. Anyways, Google that if you need more information. I have been extremely happy with the flight characteristics of this arrow. Also, by increasing, I would say 13% is moderate FOC. I don't think you get extreme until 18%, and I'd say anything under 10% would be low FOC. Most of the data I've seen is like 12 to 15% is a good moderate FOC. This is the best tuning arrow I've built yet. It tunes better than the Day 6 setup, better than the Valkyrie setup, and sure as hell better than the Cabela's fucking gold tip setup. It flies extremely well, it tunes extremely well, and the penetration on this thing is devastating. I'm gonna put a picture in right here. So this is the deer that I took in Arizona in January. I shot him at 55 yards, spot and stock, highly technical stock, and you can see how accurate, this is at 55 yards, how accurate this arrow was at that distance, and it blew completely through this deer and actually buried itself in a cactus 10 yards behind the deer. Now, because the deer was quartering towards me slightly, I only caught the front lung and a piece of the offside lung, and then I'm pretty sure the liver on the offside. So he ran maybe 150, 200 yards total before he keeled over. But I couldn't have asked for anything more out of this arrow. A couple of notes I want to make before I'm done. This is an arrow squaring device. I 100% recommend this for when you are building your own arrows. No matter how high-end the arrow is, or how finicky you are when you saw your arrows, or if somebody else is cutting your arrows, it's always good to square the ends. So I think this thing's like 30 or 40 bucks on Lancaster Archery, and you just manually roll it back and forth, and this wheel right here squares the end. Highly recommend that. Arrow stripping device, super handy to get your vanes off. It's a must-have. As I mentioned before, these are my favorite vanes for several reasons. You could debate, should it be shorter or high profile or longer and low profile? Because I shoot fixed blade, I like a fair amount of fletching in back, which means I shoot 4 fletch, and I particularly like the construction of these ones. I went with the hybrid ones and I found them to be a little bit flimsy. And I used to shoot the Max Hunters, which are a higher profile, shorter vane. They're what naturally come on the Valkyrie setup. They work really good, but for where my anchor point is and for how I shoot, the higher profile vane contacts my face down here. And A, it can impact arrow flight, and B, it tickles. So it's like super annoying when you're sitting there and shooting. So for that very practical purpose, I went down to a 4 fletch. I went down to a low profile, longer vane. Now, I also want to recommend the 4 fletch for the practical reason that you can't screw up how you put your arrow on the string, because you have a knock vane a cock vane with a 3 fletch setup, and it's always got to be at the top, and there's always this second of like looking at your arrow before you knock it and draw back. But with 4 fletch, you never have to worry about that. As long as the knock is straight up and down, which it has to be, you're good to go. So there's a lot of different things that I like about a 4 fletch setup. It just gives a bit more steering capability back there too for the fixed blade setups. These are the boning carbon wraps. The adhesive is specifically designed to go onto carbon arrows. So I highly recommend that. Get yourself a Pine Ridge spinner. They are super handy. And let's take a second and talk about high-end components. Everything on this arrow is, generally speaking, a high-end component. You could spend a little more money on the shaft if you wanted to, but not that much. These days, with the manufacturing tolerances that most of these component manufacturers are using, it's not like the old days where you get a bunch of shitty stuff and like 6 out of every 12 arrows are good and you end up chucking the rest. 90% of the time, 12 for 12 arrows should be good out of the dozen that you buy when they're this high of quality, like 0.001 straightness and grain tolerance. However, even then, when you mount your broadhead, square the arrow, put everything on perfectly, when you spin it, I will always notice like 60 to 70% of my arrows spinned beyond perfect. Like it's a thing of beauty to watch. And I always put a little mark on the end of those, and those are my primary hunting arrows. And then the other 4 or 5, there will just be like a microscopic shift. Definitely doesn't hurt arrow flight, but in my head, I know that's like a 98% arrow, not a 100% arrow. I use those ones for my target practice. I've shot those 2 arrows side by side. They fly the same. A fixed blade flies the same, but psychologically, I just know, I like knowing I have a perfect arrow in my hand every time I go hunting. I don't want anything to chip away at my confidence when I'm in that moment. If you look at the amount of money we spend, the time we spend practicing, the time we spend away from family in order to go to these places and do these things, I want to put everything within my favor to knock down an animal. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I haven't covered here today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know and I'll do my best to get back to you. And thanks for watching.